Hi, this is my next video in my set of videos called a new chord symbol. And last time I talked about the interval. I showed you a sample interval. The general name for this interval is a fifth, and the specific name for that interval is a perfect fifth. So today we're going to talk about how we even have specific names, how they were determined, how they came about. I showed you in this sample interval, right, with an F4 root and a C5, I showed you that the general name was determined, all right, by the number of staff degrees used. I showed you that clearly. And I also told you that the specific name was determined by how many half steps there are between the root and the higher tone. I showed you that. But you might be thinking, well, who came up with these names? How did they determine all of these different interval names? And you can see on here the interval names and the half steps that are used in each one. Right? Well, it's a very complicated story. I'm not actually qualified to tell it, but I'm gonna give you a very primitive, basic, infantile explanation of how these terms came about. And it might be best to start this way to show you this graph. Let's say you had a root tone of C4. Okay, there's one C4 on the bottom line here, the bottom. That's called a ledger line, that little tiny line. That's an extension of the staff. And then above those C4 notes, I have the notes of the C major scale in succession. All right, that's the notes of the C major scale. Now, by doing that, I've created a whole bunch of intervals. This first interval here is basically a C with another C. That's called a perfect prime. And it's not really even an interval because they're right at the same spot. So we don't use that and we generally don't talk about it. Very few people talk about the perfect prime. So let's just forget that. But the whole point is, if you look at this, you'll see that you have 1, 2, 3, 4 perfect intervals. And you have 1, 2, 3, 4 major intervals. All right? Now, you say, well, why do they call them perfect or why do they call them major? Well, that's the really tricky part. That's the hard part. What I do is I show this thing called the harmonic series. Now, within the realm of physics and acoustics, scholars and people who do this all the time understand this in its entirety. But I'm showing you the very primitive, very basic version of how we got our major and perfect interval names, how the naming came about. So let's say you had a guitar or a piano string and you plucked it and you wanted to make a tone C2. All right, you wanted to make the tone C2. That would be called your fundamental tone. Now what happens in the physics acoustics part of this whole thing is you're going to hear that fundamental tone prominently. But along with that fundamental tone, there are partial tones, or you could call them secondary or less significant. But the point is, those tones are affected. They actually come to life, though most people can't hear them. I can hear some of the lower ones, but ordinarily people can't hear them. Now what happens here is, along with that fundamental tone, the first tone you hear in succession after this tone, in other words, the first tone you hear in succession of pitch, all right, would be this C3. Now that C3, all right, is an octave of the fundamental. So somebody a long time ago decided to refer to this gap, this space, as an octave or a perfect octave. In other words, it's a very perfect because it's the very first. It's one of the very very critical partials that we hear. Then the next partial that we hear, all right, would be a G3. And we see here, if we look at our staff degrees, like I told you, that we have a fifth. And since that's right at the start, right at the beginning of the series of partials, they refer to that as a perfect fifth. Then the next time we encounter it would be the C4, and we see that that C4 is the interval is a fourth. All right, from the G3 to the C4 is a fourth, and they called that the perfect fourth. That's what they call them. Your perfect octave, your perfect fifth, your perfect fourth. Then here you have from your C4 to your E4, you have what they called a major third. It's not perfect like these. They call them major, which in Latin means greater. Then your next interval from E4 to G4 is a minor interval. They call that lesser because there's less half steps involved. And then here you have G to B flat, you have another minor. Then here you have B flat to C, and they call that a major second. All right? And then you have here, from E to F, you have what they call a minor second. Now, like I say, I'm not really qualified to teach this stuff. Actually, I'm not qualified to teach anything. But the point is, the perfect 1, 2, 3 intervals here, because we ignore the perfect prime, and then you have your major and minor, and they're derived from the upper partials of the harmonic series. That's just a very primitive explanation. All right? So now, they discovered, or they designed this system such that when you have a perfect interval, if you raise that interval a half step, you get an augmented interval. If that perfect interval is lowered a half step, you get a diminished interval. If the major interval's raised a half step, you get an augmented. And if the major is lowered a half step, you get a minor. And if it's lowered another half step, you'd have a diminished interval. Now that might sound complicated for the beginner, but that is how they ended up having these names, all these different names. That's how you get your little handy chart. All right? Now you say, well, that's confusing and I don't get it. Well, let's just take a look at an actual example. Here's a perfect fifth, because the general name, all right, the fifth, the 5, we have 5 staff degrees utilized, all right? And we know from our explanation earlier in our chart that that's a perfect fifth. Now here you have, instead of the C5, you have, we put a C sharp in there. And since that interval is raised just a half a step, that's an augmented fifth. The specific name is augmented fifth. And here we took that C5 out and we stuck in a C flat. So we still have a fifth, 5 staff degrees utilized, but now it's a diminished fifth because we know from our chart or we know from memorization. Now down here we have a major sixth interval. 6 staff degrees, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So we know the general name is a sixth. And it's a major, because I just explained that. We go by half steps. Now let's take out that D and put a D sharp in. Now we've raised the interval a little bit by half step, so we have an augmented sixth. That's a specific name. And here we took out that D, we put in a D flat, and we got a minor sixth because we just diminished that. We made it a little bit smaller. It's a minor sixth. Now, if we take this here, we take out that D flat, and we put a D double flat in, we've made it even smaller. Now it's a diminished sixth. So you see how that works? If you're a beginner, which I would imagine most of my viewers are, if you give it some thought, if you work it out, you'll get it. You'll say, oh, I get it. And that's it. And remember, I use my clef, but that's the same as a G clef, so don't get confused. And that's pretty much it for now. I'm going to move forward into the actual chord symbol in my next few videos. And I hope I provide something useful, something that helps you mentally envision how the chord is designed, how it's made, and stuff like that. That's it. Thank you for being patient again, and I hope to see you soon. Good night.